Night in the Alamein desert. I still remember the sound of the sand against the metal. A soft, endless whisper, like 1,000 tiny hands clawing at the truck, trying to pull us down into the desert. The engine was still warm, ticking softly in the night air, but we had killed the lights. We sat there, breathing slow, barely moving. Somewhere out there, in the black abyss beyond the dunes, they were watching. I knew it. We all knew it. The desert at night wasn't just empty, it was hungry. It swallowed sound, light, even time itself. One moment, you thought you had a grip on reality. The next, it slipped through your fingers like the fine Egyptian sand. That night, near El Alamein, we weren't just fighting Rommel's men. We were fighting the desert itself. It started hours earlier. A convoy, 6 trucks, 3 jeeps, and a single half-track escorting a load of fuel and rations toward the front. Routine. Simple. Except nothing was ever simple in this war. The brass kept saying the Germans were pulling back, that their supply lines were stretched too thin, that victory was close. But I knew better. A cornered animal is the most dangerous, and Rommel's boys were no different. I was behind the wheel of my truck, a solid hunk of Detroit steel that had carried me through more hell than I cared to count. My co-driver, Danny O'Reilly, sat beside me, chewing on an unlit cigarette. He had a nervous habit of tapping his fingers on the dash 12123, like some damn jazz drummer who didn't know when to quit. Feel that, he muttered. I did. The air had changed. The wind had died. The desert had gone still. Then came the first shot. A sharp crack, followed by the unmistakable sound of a tire bursting. The truck in front of me lurched, swerving hard before skidding to a stop. Then another shot, this one closer, more precise. The windshield of a Jeep shattered, the driver slumping forward, his hands still gripping the wheel. Ambush, someone yelled. But by then, we already knew. Danny was out of the truck before I could stop him, fumbling for his rifle. I grabbed mine, sliding out the door, keeping low. Shadows moved along the ridge, figures barely visible against the dark sky. The Germans weren't rushing in. No, they were waiting, watching. We scrambled for cover behind the trucks, our rifles shaking in our hands. The silence stretched, thick as molasses, until finally the desert exhaled. A single flare shot into the sky, painting the dunes in a sickly red glow. That's when I saw them, 5, maybe 6 figures creeping through the sand, rifles raised, eyes gleaming like wolves in the dark. And then the shooting started. The desert exploded in a hail of gunfire, bullets slicing through the night, kicking up sand, tearing through canvas and steel. I pressed my back against the truck's thick metal body, feeling its vibrations as rounds thudded into it. Danny was crouched beside me, his rifle clutched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He muttered something under his breath. Maybe a prayer, maybe a curse, maybe both. There wasn't time to ask. The Germans weren't rushing us like some Hollywood movie charge. They were patient, methodical. A few shots, then silence. A shadow here, a flicker of movement there. They were testing us, feeling us out. They knew we were out of our depth, stranded in their hunting grounds with no cover, no reinforcements, and nowhere to run. Cover me, I growled at Danny, not waiting for an answer before breaking into a low sprint toward the nearest Jeep. The sand was treacherous, shifting under my boots, but I made it, dropping behind the vehicle just as another shot rang out, punching a hole through the windshield where my head had been a second earlier. I hit the ground hard, my heart pounding like a war drum, tasting the grit of sand in my teeth. From my new position, I had a clearer view of the ridge. I could see them now. Dark figures moving like ghosts, quick and quiet. One of them knelt, taking careful aim, his silhouette framed against the pale glow of the rising moon. I didn't think. I raised my rifle, steadied my breath, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and final, and the figure crumpled. For a moment, everything stopped. No gunfire. No movement. Just the wind picking up again, carrying away the echoes of my shot like a thief stealing evidence of a crime. I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a sick hollow weight settling in my chest. But there was no time to dwell on it. The Germans adjusted their tactics. No more testing. No more waiting. They came at us fast now, using the dunes as cover, flanking us before we could react. The first grenade landed near the lead truck, a dull thump followed by a flash of light and a wave of heat. The explosion tore through the vehicle, sending a shower of burning debris into the air. Someone screamed. I didn't know who. Danny was firing wildly, shouting something I couldn't make out over the chaos. The others were doing the same, rifles cracking, muzzle flashes painting ghostly images on the dunes. But it was all reaction, all desperation. The Germans had control. We were just trying to survive. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. The gunfire ceased, the shadows pulled back, and the desert returned to its unnatural silence. It wasn't victory. It was something worse. They weren't retreating. They were waiting. I didn't trust it. Danny didn't either. He wiped sweat and sand from his face, glancing at me with an expression I didn't like. They're playing with us, he muttered, barely audible. And he was right. The real nightmare hadn't even begun yet. The silence was the worst part. After the gunfire, after the chaos, after the screams, there was nothing. Just the wind, shifting the sand in slow, whispering waves, and the sound of our own breath, too fast, too shallow. The night stretched out, vast and merciless, and somewhere beyond the dunes, they were still there, watching, waiting. Danny and I crouched behind the jeep, our rifles clutched tight, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The others were scattered across the wreckage of our convoy, taking cover behind what was left of the trucks, tending to the wounded, trying to figure out what the hell to do next. We had started with 20 men. Now I wasn't sure how many were left. I could hear someone coughing, ragged and wet. Someone else was whispering, too low to make out the words. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that the Germans hadn't finished us off when they had the chance. That meant one of two things. Either they were waiting for reinforcements, or they had something worse planned. We need to move, Danny whispered, his voice tight. They'll pick us off if we stay here. I knew he was right, but where the hell were we supposed to go? There was nothing out here, just endless dunes and the cold, uncaring stars overhead. If we ran, we'd be running blind, right into the desert's open arms. If we stayed, we were sitting ducks. Then we saw the light. It was faint at first, barely more than a glow on the horizon, flickering like a mirage. But it was there. A single point of warmth in the endless blackness. A village, maybe. Or an outpost. Something. Danny saw it too. We head for that, he said, already moving before I could argue. We started gathering the others, moving low, whispering instructions. The wounded who could walk, we helped to their feet. The ones who couldn't, we carried as best we could. No one questioned it. No one hesitated. Staying meant death. Moving at least gave us a chance. The first steps were the hardest. Every crunch of sand under our boots felt deafening. Every movement felt like it would give us away. The dunes loomed around us, too high, too wide, hiding whatever shadows lurked beyond. But nothing came. No gunfire. No pursuit. The Germans were letting us go. The realization sent a chill through me, colder than the night air. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't luck. They wanted us to run. And still, we kept going. The light ahead grew closer, brighter. It wasn't a mirage. It was real. A small settlement, maybe no more than a handful of buildings, half buried in the sand. A place that shouldn't have been there, that wasn't marked on any map. That's when the first man disappeared. 1 second, he was there, struggling forward with the rest of us. The next, gone. No sound, no cry, no trace. Just gone. We stopped, scanning the darkness, rifles raised, hearts pounding. Then another man vanished. And another. Panic set in. Some men ran forward, desperate to reach the light. Others froze, gripping their weapons like lifelines. I turned to Danny, my mouth dry as the sand beneath us. This isn't right, I whispered. Then I saw the footprints. Not ours. The ones circling us. Closing in. The realization hit like a fist to the gut. The footprints in the sand weren't ours. They were too neat, too precise, forming a pattern that made no sense, circles, spirals, weaving between our own tracks in a way that defied logic. The desert had been still when we stopped, no sign of movement, no whisper of approach. And yet, these prints were fresh, as if something had been walking among us unseen, untouched by the moonlight. The men were whispering now, some in English, others in languages I barely recognized. Prayers, curses, half-formed questions that had no answers. Someone clutched a rosary. Another man was running his hands over his rifle, as if it were some kind of talisman. Danny's fingers were tight around my arm, his breath shallow. "We need to keep moving," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Whatever this is, we can't stay here." No one argued. The pull of that distant light was stronger than fear, stronger than reason. We pressed forward, our boots sinking into the sand, the wind picking up again, whispering through the dunes like a voice just out of reach. The footprints followed us, but we stopped looking at them. We had to. The alternative was madness. The settlement was close now. I could make out the outlines of buildings, small, squat structures half buried in the dunes, their walls worn smooth by time and wind. No sound came from within. No sign of movement. Just that single, flickering light burning in the center of it all, casting long shadows against the sand. It felt like an invitation, or a warning. Danny was the first to step forward. His rifle was raised, his eyes darting from doorway to doorway, searching for any sign of life. I followed, my own rifle heavy in my hands, my pulse hammering in my ears. The others moved in behind us, their footsteps hesitant, uncertain. We reached the first building. Its door was missing, the inside nothing but darkness. The air smelled of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. I stepped inside, my boots crunching against the floor. The walls were covered in markings, symbols carved into the stone, worn and ancient. Some looked like letters, others like twisted shapes that made my stomach turn just looking at them. Danny ran a hand over one of the carvings, his fingers coming away, coated in fine sand. "What the hell is this place?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, the light outside flickered. Then, one by one, the men outside started to disappear. No sound, no struggle, just gone. One moment they were there, standing in the dim glow of that strange firelight, their faces tight with exhaustion and fear. The next, they were nothing. Danny cursed, spinning around, his rifle up, but there was nothing to shoot at. No sign of movement, just that same crushing silence, stretching out across the dunes. The footprints in the sand had deepened, their patterns more intricate, more deliberate. They weren't just following us anymore. They were leading somewhere. I don't know who ran first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was Danny. Maybe it was all of us at once. But we ran. Into the buildings, through the narrow passageways, trying to find something, anything that made sense. But the deeper we went, the worse it became. The walls were closing in. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against my skin like a weight. I turned a corner and nearly slammed into Danny, who had stopped dead in his tracks. His face was pale, his eyes locked on something ahead. I followed his gaze. The footprints ended in a perfect circle. And in the center of that circle, the sand had been disturbed, shifted in a way that didn't make sense. It wasn't piled up or scattered. It had sunk, like something had been pulled beneath. And then, without warning, Danny was gone. No scream, no struggle, just air where he had been. I staggered back, my rifle shaking in my hands, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The silence deepened, stretching out like an open maw, waiting to swallow me whole. And then I heard it. A whisper. Not the wind. Not the shifting sand. Something else. Something old. Something waiting. And it was right behind me. I didn't turn around. Somewhere deep in my gut, in that primal part of the brain that remembers what it's like to be hunted, I knew that looking back would be the worst thing I could do. My hands were shaking so hard the rifle felt like it might slip from my grip, but I held onto it, forcing my breath to slow, forcing my legs to move. One step, then another. The whisper didn't stop. It wasn't words, at least not ones I could understand. It was more like a murmur, something low and rhythmic, pressing against my ears, burrowing into my skull like a thought that wasn't mine. The sand beneath my boots was shifting, pulling at me, urging me to stop. I didn't. I moved toward the only thing that still made sense, the flickering light at the center of the settlement. It was closer now, just beyond the next crumbling wall, burning low and steady, untouched by the wind. It wasn't fire. Not exactly. The glow was strange, too still, too perfect, like it was being held in place by something unseen. Behind me, the whispering grew louder. I didn't look. I kept moving, kept pushing forward until I stepped into the open space at the heart of the ruins. And there it was, a fire pit, but not like any I'd ever seen. No wood, no fuel, just smooth black stones arranged in a perfect circle, glowing from within, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The air around it was heavy, thick with something I couldn't name, something that made my vision blur at the edges. And then I saw them. The men who had disappeared. They stood at the edge of the pit, their backs to me, motionless. Their uniforms were torn, their boots half buried in the sand, their hands hanging limp at their sides. Danny was there too, his head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something just beyond the edge of hearing. I took a step forward, my mouth dry, my voice barely more than a whisper. Danny. He turned. His eyes weren't his anymore. They were black, deep, and endless, reflecting the firelight in ways that didn't make sense. His lips moved, but the sound that came out wasn't his voice. It wasn't any voice. It was the whisper. The same one that had been following us through the dunes, the same one that had slithered into my ears when the first man disappeared. The others turned too, one by one, their faces blank, their bodies unnaturally still. They weren't breathing, weren't blinking. They just stood there, watching me, waiting. I took a step back. The sand shifted beneath my feet, pulling me down, urging me forward. The fire pulsed, the stones glowing brighter, the air growing heavier, thicker. Then they moved. Not fast, not slow, just inevitable. I raised the rifle, my hands slick with sweat, my pulse hammering in my ears. Stay back, I rasped, though I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever they were now, whatever had taken them, it didn't care about bullets. It didn't care about fear. The whispering surged, filling the night, filling my head, pressing against my skull until it felt like my mind might split open. The fire pulsed. The sand shifted. The world tilted. And then, darkness. I woke up to the sun rising over the dunes, its light washing the desert in pale gold. My rifle was gone. My boots were half buried in the sand. The ruins were behind me, quiet and lifeless. No sign of the fire, no sign of the others. No footprints. Nothing. Just me. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, my mind a foggy mess of memories that didn't fit together. The convoy, the attack, the footprints, the whispering, the fire. Danny. I turned back toward the ruins, but they looked different now. Smaller, older, as if they had been abandoned for centuries. The carvings were still there, but worn down to nothing but shallow grooves in the stone. Whatever had happened, if it had happened, it was gone now. Erased, swallowed by the desert, like everything else. I started walking. There was no choice. The sun was climbing, and if I didn't find water soon, I'd be joining whatever ghosts haunted that place. If I wasn't one of them already. Hours passed, maybe more. Time didn't feel real anymore. But eventually, I saw something on the horizon. Convoy. American trucks. Soldiers. Real. Solid. Moving toward me. I waved, stumbled, shouted something I didn't remember, and they saw me. A jeep peeled away from the others, racing toward me, kicking up sand in its wake. The driver was young, his uniform crisp, his face full of concern. Jesus, buddy, what happened to you? I tried to answer. I really did. But the words wouldn't come. They took me in, gave me water, asked questions I couldn't answer. They said they'd been looking for our convoy, that we'd been reported missing 2 days ago. 2 days. I didn't argue. I didn't tell them about the footprints, the fire, the whispering. Because as the jeep rolled forward, kicking up dust, I caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A figure. Standing alone on the dunes, half hidden by the rising sun. Watching. Danny. I blinked. He was gone. The desert swallowed him whole, just like it always does.